Apple's replacement of Andrea with Ammar Suber Mania as the executive in charge of AI for the company is reflective of an overall trend in the industry. Where are businesses going with AI? How will the technology be applied? And most importantly, where are the profits? That's the topic of this episode of Utilizing AI from the Futurum Group, featuring Frederic Van Haren of Highfence and Jon Swartz of TechStrong. Welcome to Utilizing AI, the podcast focused on practical applications of artificial intelligence from the Futurum Group. Each episode brings together diverse perspectives to explore news and use cases of the ways in which AI is transforming enterprise IT and the industries it serves. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett, president of the Tech Field Day business unit here at the Futurum Group. And before we dive in, let's meet who's on the panel today.
Yeah, I'm Frederic Van Haren. I'm the founder and CTO of Highfence, and we provide HPC and AI consulting services.
Hey, I'm Jon Swartz. I'm senior content writer for TechStrong Group, and I also work for Futurum Group, where I do some various duties.
And as for me, as I mentioned, I run Tech Field Day. I also am the co-host, along with a certain Mr. Frederic Van Haren, of the Utilizing Tech podcast series. We just wrapped up 9 seasons, including 4 of those seasons focused exclusively on AI, with Frederic co-hosting. So, Frederic, it's really great to have you joining us here on the this new platform, this new weekly platform that we're kicking off here. We have discussed prior to the recording a topic that I think is a pretty interesting one. We just heard the news that Apple has removed Jon and Andrea, who had been running machine learning and AI strategy. That's the proper title. I don't want to strip him of his title, though I guess Apple already did.
They already did. Yeah.
They removed him in favor of Ammar Suber Mania, a former Googler, short-time Microsoftie, who's going to be taking over AI. This follows, actually, the fact that Apple removed Jon and Andrea from Siri back in the spring and put Mike Rockwell in charge. What does this mean to us? Now, again, we don't want to necessarily be all Apple political. That's not what this podcast is about. But what does this mean for the bigger picture of AI in the enterprise, Jon?
Well, I mean, for Apple, it's just a kind of an acknowledgement and an admission that Apple Intelligence, which was launched amid much ballyhoo in 2024, has just not gained traction or not met the expectations of especially Tim Cook, but it's in the market. So Apple's considered late in this market. Siri is a kind of a continuing headache for the company. We're not going to see any real significant news or advancements in terms of Apple AI, and probably at least until 2026, probably the spring of 2026 at the earliest. So it's a struggle, and it's an admission, because there have been some other folks at Apple within that division who have left in terms of Apple Intelligence, and it's just not a problem at Apple. We can talk about that later, and I'll kick it back to you. But there are several high-profile companies that are going through this same kind of growing pains with this so-called Chief AI Officer. I mean, the whole concept and the whole idea of how it fits within an organization and how it's supposed to spearhead this AI growth, which has become a much more difficult task, I think, within corporations than they really expected it to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. We see from a consumer perspective, AI changing really rapidly. And in certain cases, people don't even know where it's going. And the same thing applies to people, right? It's still people running organizations. And, no matter the title we give these individuals, it's still challenging for them to figure out which way to go. And I think what we're seeing is organizations, like you said, struggling to figure out, what kind of organization and what kind of strategy do we need to apply in order to find the proper strategy.
Oh, yeah, I just want to, so Frederic is exactly right about what's going on within these companies. And it's not just Apple. So Apple is a convenient company that we look at, such a high profile company that whenever anything happens, we jump all over it. But I think what happened there is part and parcel of what's happening throughout some of the really high profile companies. So I think I mentioned GM. General Motors had their first CAIO depart after less than a year. So over the weekend, a few days ago, this has been going on. They got rid of this guy, Barak Turovsky, and he was only there for 8 months. And it's not as if he's some sort of schmo they grabbed off the street. He'd worked at PayPal, Microsoft, Google, Cisco, but they weren't happy with their progress. At the same time, our friends at Intel went through the same situation where their chief technology and AI officer left after 6 months. So he went to OpenAI. So he's probably a bit of a hot commodity. Another example, Meta's chief AI scientist and one of the pioneers of modern AI is leaving to start his own company. It's it's something that, when we first heard about this concept of the CAIO, one of the things that I heard is in terms of feedback was, how is this person going to fit in with the CIO, the CTO, the CDO? How do they interact? I mean, is it just a new position that creates even more organizational confusion? And I'm wondering if this is now we've reached a point where after 6 months to a year, these companies are acknowledging that the structure isn't working within their confines. And I'm wondering if we're going to start seeing more examples of this. And again, it's part of this growing pain of AI. Everyone wants to jump on this bandwagon, cash in. They want a ROI. They're spending tons of money. There's so much pressure from the top down that consequently there are going to be folks who are collateral damage as a result. And they usually are the people in charge of the AI division.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually an important thing. You mentioned that some people in the tech industry have said, "Oh, Apple is behind on AI." I think that has to do more with Apple's unique position in the industry. Apple is not, in my opinion, a competitor for Google, AWS, Meta, Microsoft. In terms of being a developer of sort of the foundational models here, or building out, infrastructure for others to use. Apple actually reminds me more of like a Ford Motor Company in terms of their use of AI, because essentially, even though they develop a technological product, even though they're seen as one of, the big, Magnificent Seven or whatever, they're actually really more of a product company than any of those companies. And in a way, even though Andrea's title was not chief AI officer, his function was actually something more akin to what you'd see at a Fortune 50, global company. In other words, how do we use this technology? How do we incorporate it with our core products? Importantly, how do we make money off of this technology? How do we make it real for our customers? I think that ultimately was the problem here, that Apple was looking at it and saying, we need somebody who can guide us forward in order to figure out, what AI means to Apple, not necessarily somebody who is going to, I don't know, build a new Apple AI engine or something. Now, on the flip side, of course, Apple is trying to develop a new Siri, and they have promoted a new person, Mike Rockwell, in the spring in charge of Siri, because, as was reported at the time, that Frederic had decided that Andrea was not the right person to move Siri forward. But I do feel like, in a way, Apple is not like the others and is really facing the same kind of questions that a lot of our listeners out there at regular non-tech companies are facing when it comes to AI.
The one thing that's going to be really interesting to me is Apple is going to be going head to head with OpenAI, I would assume, in terms of the consumer market. And what is like the delicious irony in all this is what Johnny Ive's going to do. So there's speculation now that OpenAI famously bought his startup uh, to create ostensibly some sort of hardware device, some sort of device that would be potentially an iPhone competitor, be some sort of AI device. There's rumors are starting to spread that they're going to probably see something by 2027, most likely. So the guy who helped design iPhone, the father of the design, is now at OpenAI. So it'd be interesting, and I think maybe Apple is just trying to get ahead of that because I believe, in my opinion, and I don't know if you all agree with me or not. I've been waiting for some sort of compelling device from Apple for so long. Right, the goggles were a miss. The watch was semi successful, but it was kind of reformatted for a different type of use. There was always the rumors of a car technology. So I think maybe the obvious thing would be some sort of AI type of device. We don't know what it'll be, but there's so much pressure on this company to kind of go beyond just the phone.
Yeah, I think it's important to make a distinction between what I would call a core technology provider, somebody building large language models like an OpenAI, who is trying to actually build uh, customer applications. What I mean with application is a more than a rudimentary text interface, right, to their technology. So I think from that perspective, I think OpenAI is adventuring itself into an area where they could be competing with Apple. Apple, on the other hand, I would look at them more as an integrator of the technology. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but it seems like Apple is more concerned about how to use the technology and integrate that with their users. But it all makes sense, right? I think one thing, going back to my research days, in AI, in the early days, we really didn't know, and probably today too, technology wise, we really didn't know whether it was going to work or not. So we kind of threw stuff at the wall and see what sticks and then go with that. It seems like they're doing the same thing with titles and people, right? So they're kind of hiring people, trying to figure out if these candidates can bring them to the next level. And if it doesn't stick, they just move on.
And maybe that's not a bad way to be if you're Apple. Maybe it's and if you're any of these other, kind of big end user companies. I mean, ultimately the proof is in the pudding. And if an executive is able to perform and able to do the thing that you want them to do, then you keep them. And if they're not, well, I guess they weren't the right person for you. I think somebody earlier said it's kind of like salespeople. Sales leaders at companies often come in and, they do or they do not, and they're given a bit of a leash, and then they're yanked right out of there if it's not working. Um, it could be something like that happens with these AI leaders.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, this is a kind of like uncharted territory for some of these companies. Like you think about, they're plunging into something that they know is going to be big. I think in Apple's case, I give them credit for being so disciplined. Like this is a company that knows how to integrate a product within its ecosystem without disrupting it. They keep you within the ecosystem. So they've been probably sussing that out. When I think of a company like Meta, I think of them as kind of like just jumping from one trend to another and then ripping things up and starting all over. Like Zuckerberg has never been afraid of breaking things and then trying to fix them as fast as possible. One thing I didn't mention is that in addition to the companies that are going through this kind of CAIO transformation, government's doing the same thing. So the head of AI for CISA and same thing for Justice Department, the head of AI both services, both those individuals left after less than a year. I'm not sure what the exact reasons were, but the government wasn't happy with the progress in both those cases. So we're going to see this. I mean, it's just things are moving so fast. There's so much money involved in all these endeavors that we're going to see people come and go. And maybe, as in the case with Intel and the Meta execs, one went to OpenAI and one went to a startup. Maybe they see an opportunity to do something on their own now that they've been within a corporate culture and they see what those corporations are going to be doing.
Yeah. On the Apple point, if we kind of look at that, I think that it's interesting that there's this vibe that somehow Apple has been a failure post Steve Jobs. I should also point out that on October 28th, Apple's market cap topped $4 trillion for the first time ever. Also, it's interesting, as you mentioned, the Apple Watch, you look at that and you're like, yeah, but really, how valuable is it? Is that really a separate product? Well, think about it this way. Before Apple entered the fitness tracking market, the total revenues in fitness tracking were estimated at just under $10 billion, about $9.8 billion with companies like Garmin and Fitbit and so on. As of today, Apple sells about $30 billion of Apple Watches, and Google has purchased Fitbit, and the total fitness market has ballooned, fitness tracker market has ballooned, but still is now dominated by Apple and Google. That doesn't sound like a flop to me. But to your point, I don't think Apple knew that they were getting the fitness market. I think Apple thought they were getting into the watch market. And it was only sort of the putting in the spaghetti on the wall that said, wait a second, people like tracking their heart rate and their, exercise, their runs, that's what this is for. I think that Apple originally thought that the watch was going to be somehow the next generation iPhone, which of course would be a bit larger of a market than $30 billion, which, admittedly that's a lot of money. But, I think they maybe expected, and maybe Apple did, maybe others did, that would be where Apple would go with this thing. But instead, what they ended up with is a really nice product that not only dominates, tripled the size of the fitness market, dominates that market, but also, I should point out, as a watch blogger, generates more revenue than the entire Swiss watch industry. So, it ain't a bad market by any means.
Oh yeah, they also discovered, Stephen, that the watch is a really good primer for younger users. So one thing Apple had told me a couple of years ago was that they were discovering that in the education market, they were using it as a way for parents. It's like a kind of controlled settings on the watch where the kids would use it with kind of a rudimentary applications, but it was a way to kind of track their kids. It was a way to get the kids used to using Apple technology and kind of graduating them to the iPhone. That's what Apple's ultimate goal is. But they were finding it to be kind of a hit among younger kids in K through 12. So they were finding different uses, and that's kind of the beauty of this company. The products are so good at certain points. It will find an audience, eventually. And I think that maybe that's part of maybe some of the, I wouldn't say struggles, but some of the kind of maturation process that Apple's going through. Because as we've alluded to before, this company gets into markets after other companies have somewhat established a market, and then they take it to a totally different level in terms of revenue and in terms of customer satisfaction. And I think they're probably doing the same thing with AI that they did with the phone industry, the watch industry, the tablet industry, music player industry, with the iPod. It'll be interesting because I really do think that they eventually will hit their mark. It's just a question of when.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's if you look at, and you brought up the phone, if you look at the phone, when the phone came out, people were saying, why do we need a device for just calling people? But the reality is that most people use their phone not as a phone to dial up and call people, but it's for all kind of other stuff. And the same thing with the watch. I think that's one of the things that Apple is good at, is to take a device with a well-known functionality and widen that functionality way beyond its original design.
Yeah, and that actually makes me wonder, to your point, John, about Johnny Ive and OpenAI. I mean, Ive was definitely trying to figure out what an AI device would be. And I think that that's fundamentally what we're asking here is, okay, if AI were to be represented in the physical space, what would that device be? I think that's what Apple is trying to figure out. What Google, what OpenAI, what Microsoft, all these companies. And of course, there's all those sort of the microphone badge type items that people are starting to wear. If you go to Silicon Valley, you cannot escape these pendants and badges that everybody's wearing that's recording everything constantly. It's everywhere. And I think that what was that? What was that little one that kind of flopped? That was like a pin, the AI pin. What was that thing called? I don't remember.
Yes, yeah, I know what you're talking
And
about, right. It was famously written about,
yeah,
right.
but point
I
is,
got the concept
I
was
think all of
interesting.
these companies are trying to figure it out.
Yeah, no, I mean, God, I mean, it was so difficult to see where this is all going because, one of the things too about Apple, and I think you talked about this before, Stephen, in a previous podcast, is that Apple didn't like splurge. They're not like throwing tons of money into building out data centers for AI. I mean, they're not. They've been wise in how they've devoted their resources, which I think is an advantage for them versus, say, a Meta, which is just not afraid to splurge at all. Um, but yeah, the
They're just
form of what
pouring
this
money
will
into it.
be. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God, 600. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the amount of money that the amount of numbers that are thrown out with OpenAI, the last one I saw was 1.4 trillion through various arrangements and partnerships and in announced investments. I mean, it won't go anywhere near that, but that's a crazy crucible to hang over a company when your revenue is $20 billion a year, and you're I mean, as you mentioned, Apple's watch does more than that a year. Um, so that's why when we talk about Apple, I always think about the mountain of cash they're sitting on, the market valuation. They've got the tried and true revenue stream, knock on wood, for iPhone, as they have had for more than a decade plus. And you kind of look at the flip side or some of their competitors who are not nearly as successful in in some of those areas trying to get into AI. So with Apple, there's so many possibilities.
Yeah, those are good points, John. I think one of the important factors to distinct is that companies like Meta and OpenAI are core technology providers, so they have to build the large language models. So they really, to a certain degree, don't have a choice than to spend a lot of that money. And the bigger the better, for the simple reason that we live in a world of competition, right? It's really important that if OpenAI comes with a feature or capabilities before their competitors. And so now you have this wild grow of data centers that they have to build out. If you look at Apple, I look at Apple more as an integrator of or consumer of that technology, and they integrate that into their products. And so they have the ability or the option, I guess, to build their own large language models, but they don't have to, considering that the market has a decent amount of large language models available today.
Yeah. And what we're hearing is that Apple is going to be licensing, that they had a bake off and that they're going to be licensing Gemini from Google. I'm not shocked by that. Gemini is really solid. I'm sure that Google also is a really good Apple partner after handing them billions of dollars over the last 20 years in search revenue. And maybe the fact that this new guy that's going to be heading AI at Apple came from Google, uh, should we read into that at all?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So one thing too is that it always surfaces. There's always that rumor that still is out there that Apple may, they don't do a lot of big acquisitions. They rarely do them, but the idea of buying like a Perplexity for search would make sense. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but given their history, Apple's history with Google, and then this guy they've brought in, I don't know, but something's got to be done about Siri. I mean, that's obvious. It's a major hindrance and albatross. There has been in terms of the AI developments. Um, but anyway, hey, here's another thing: we also have to think about the future of Apple at the top. I mean, Cook is just turned 65. He had a glorious run at Apple. I mean, he built the company as an operations guy above and beyond what Jobs could have dreamed of. Um, Jobs created the foundation, and then Cook just built upon it brilliantly. But there was talk that he is probably going to be leaving next year. So who's in charge? Who comes next? And what those person's ideas and energy brings.
Yeah, I think there's many challenges there. I think change of a CEO is always important because that's kind of indicates most of the time a change in direction, and certainly at Apple has been the case. Um, I also think that one of the benefits of Apple is that they don't have to pick a dedicated partner. They can be the company that chooses, at will. And so they have the benefit to build a platform, if you wish, where they just pick the winner. I mean, the same thing like with the operating system, right? They built their own operating system at first, and then they just relied on somebody else's because there already was a proven track record. So they don't have to come up and be the leader from a core technology perspective. They can play Switzerland and provide to their customers, maybe with a choice of what's best for their users.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point because they came out way back in 24 with their Apple Intelligence announcement saying that they would be working with multiple partners, but that OpenAI and ChatGPT was going to be the first that they implemented. And it was. Today, you can use ChatGPT through Siri on your iPhone already. But of course, they had said way back then that Google would be next, and that never came. Then we heard, like we talked about, this idea that Apple would be using Gemini as the next generation Siri model. I think you're right, Frederic. Apple is really cannily and cash conservatively playing the AI game in a way that might end up looking pretty smart in the future. We'll see what works. We'll move forward slowly. I mean, I don't think that they're really bothered if pundits are saying they're behind the eight ball and not doing AI right. I think they're probably looking at the market share of all these other companies and saying, "Oh yeah, you're really doing AI right too over there." We'll see, man.
Well,
There's
that's
definitely evolution happening.
well, the narrative now, like the overriding narrative in Silicon Valley, at least, is that OpenAI is drowning in debt. Like they
Yeah,
the math just doesn't add up. Like it's like how are they possibly going to increase their revenue 10, 20, 30 times? It still won't be enough to pay off all the money they're borrowing. And that is a story that keeps gaining traction. The Financial Times just wrote about it. There have been some studies that address this issue. And Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, is finding himself spending more time playing defense than he probably ever imagined he would. And you talk about Apple and how cannily they play this. You're absolutely right, Stephen. They're not throwing money into this because they can afford to not throw money into it.
yeah, and on that point too, you look at Google and Microsoft especially, but also Amazon, and you say, here's companies that spent huge sums of money to play the AI game. They've bought tons of hardware. They've given OpenAI, they've invested in OpenAI. They've invested in a lot of this stuff. But here's also some companies that maybe see a path forward, a business path forward. They're actually making money. They're converting users to paying customers. Well, maybe a little tougher than it might be, but they are making money, and I think that they could make money ultimately on AI. Um, uh, uh, in terms of who's tied their boat to OpenAI, NVIDIA, Oracle, I worry about them sometimes. I worry whether they're, if this financial catastrophe happens for OpenAI, what does that mean for the rest of the industry? But I'll tell you what. Apple is their boat is over on the side at tied to the dock. They're just going to feel a little bob in the waters if something like that should happen.
That's one thing. I just really quickly, sorry, Frederick, is that Cook was again. He's like the best COO ever, perhaps in tech history. That's why he was anointed to replace Jobs. He knows the financial side as well as anyone in terms of investing, in terms of operational efficiency. And I think this has been part of his calculus for the last few years. He's letting them spend like crazy because they have to in many cases. But I think that's inherently an advantage to not do as much as others. It's going to sound weird, but sometimes you get ahead by not doing as much as other people are trying to do.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Apple board is significantly different from the OpenAI board, right? There's no way that the Apple board will ever allow the amount of spending without a a uh, a wild return on investment, so to speak, if there is ever any. So I think that the two boards are acting differently, and I think that's what we're seeing in the market. But you need both. You need people that go full force, develop the technology, with partners like NVIDIA and others, see what comes out of it. And then you have people like Apple who look maybe from the side and say, what is the technology we can integrate? How can we make our products better? What kind of devices can benefit from this? And in the end, provide the consumers a better use of their devices.
I think Frederic summarized it really well. I mean, I think it's like I'll resort to the cliche, okay, because I'm a reporter. It's like the tortoise and the hare. I mean, Apple is seeing this in a different way than others are. Others are pursuing these partnerships. I sometimes think it's literally crazy. All these cooperation, competition going on between all these companies overlapping with one another. It's pretty head spinning. They're churning out models one after another. It's just like this leapfrog game, this money game, money pit. And then Apple is just kind of slowly, methodically watching it all happen because they can afford to do this because they have that incredible revenue engine with iPhone and out their other products, and Apple services in particular. So again, they are playing the long game versus everyone else who's in a mad dash.
And they're making money at that long game. Kind of back to the start here. So Apple announced that Jon and Andrea is going to retire. They had already taken Siri out from under him earlier this year. They had already leaked, potentially, Apple probably was the leak, that Tim Cook would be stepping down as CEO and potentially John Ternus, their hardware VP, would be stepping back up into that position. I think that Apple is trying to position themselves for growth wherever this AI market happens. I think they're trying to position themselves as a steady alternative to the big bets in the tech industry. Apparently, they weren't satisfied with what was happening with Siri, but I don't think that was an existential crisis for Apple. I think that was more of, as it's being painted by some, I think it's more of Apple reacting to the market and reacting to their internal development, saying we got to change how things are being done here. So it really is an interesting point. And back as well to the thought, those of you who are listening to this and you are at product companies and you're trying to implement AI, that's, I guess, the takeaway. Think about what works. Think about what's actually attracting customers, what's actually building revenue, what's actually improving the experience of people using your applications. Don't just throw a chatbot in there. Don't just, implement AI for AI's sake. Certainly, unless you got somebody like Frederic to help you, don't buy pallets of GPUs with no idea how to do them or what to do with them. He knows, by the way, he knows how to make that happen. But do think about how AI can serve the needs of your customers and help build a better business for you. So thank you for joining me for this episode of Utilizing AI from the Futurum Group. As we wrap up, where can people connect with you and continue this conversation, Frederic?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn as Frederic V. Haren and on our website, hyphens.com.
And Jon?
Yeah, I'm like Frederic. I'm big on LinkedIn, so it's J Swartz. That's where I am. I don't really go in other social media areas.
And of course, Jon, you and I see each other on the TechStrong gang pretty frequently as well over at TechStrong TV. As for me, you'll find me as S. Foskett on most social media networks, including the old LinkedIn, as well as Blue Sky, Mastodon, and others. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Utilizing AI podcast. If you enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe on YouTube or in your favorite podcast application, and consider giving us a rating, a review, or maybe a little message. This podcast is brought to you by the analysts and experts at the Futurum Group, where insights meet AI. For show notes and more episodes, head over to techstrong.ai, the Utilizing AI YouTube channel, or the new TechStrong TV app on all of your favorite platforms. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next week.